It's the middle of the season and your BOSS auger pintle spreader is bound up. That chain inside is broke and you got to change it. Or it's the end of the season and you're taking that chain off so that you can store this thing for the summer. Either way, the topic of today's video, we're going to discuss how to remove and replace this pintle chain spreader in the BOSS VBX 8000. Now this is not at all a hard process, although it can be a little bit dirty. All right. Simple tools that you're going to need for this are simply going to be a pry tool, 2 1 1/8" box end wrenches, simple set of pliers, a Sharpie, and maybe some tape. I'll explain where those come in later. And it's a good idea to start off with some penetrating oil. Let's get started. Now that we've removed our rear spinner assembly and our rear poly cover, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to rotate this pintle chain just until the master links become visible at the rear of the spreader. Now, like I said before, you're going to have penetrating oil. If you've got some time, it's a good idea to give those master links a good coating of penetrating oil, because if this thing has been in this spreader for any length of time, there's a pretty good chance that stuff is corroded and it's not going to be that easy to get out. Now, while we got that penetrating oil on that master link at the rear of the spreader, it's time to get to the front of the spreader and actually gain access to the adjuster bolts which put tension on that pintle chain. We got to take the tension off that chain if we want to easily remove and reinstall a new pintle in the back. So to do so, what we got to do is we got to take off this plastic poly cover. So again, using your simple pry tool, you're going to be removing 4 of these quick rivets from the back side. Once we get that cover off completely, there's one more poly cover that we're going to have to remove, and that's the small cover over the actual pillow block bearing and the adjuster bolts themselves. There's one on each side. So you simply, using the pry tool, remove this rear cover. Now, using our 1 1/8" box end bolts, what you're going to be doing is simply taking the tension off the locking nut inside, and then we're going to be driving the adjuster bolt inward to loosen or slacken the pintle chain itself. So I'm simply going to crack this loose. It's loose, and I'm going to adjust my bolt inward, giving slack on my pintle chain. This is where it's nice when you put anti-seize on the threads the year before. Like so. You're going to do this evenly on both sides, then we're going to go back to the rear of the spreader and take that master link out. Now it's a simple matter of simply taking out the master links themselves, like so. And separating the links of the chain itself. We've now separated 2 halves of our pintle chain. Now that we've got our pintle half separated, we're ready to withdraw the old pintle chain and install the new one. Now it makes it a lot easier if you use a piece of rope for doing this. What you're going to do is you're going to take this approximately 16 to 20 foot piece of rope and you're going to tie it off on the lower half of the pintle chain itself, so that when we withdraw the old pintle chain from the system, the rope will thread itself through. Then when we're reinstalling, we simply install the other end of the rope, pull it back through, makes it a lot easier. Now that we tied off the rope, you're going to need an assistant for this next step. So what I have is I've got my assistant in the cab of the truck with the key on and the controller on. And what he's going to do when I give him a signal is he's going to turn on the feed motor at a rate of probably 1 or 2. All right. What you're going to do with this lower segment where you have the rope tied, you're going to want to make sure that it feeds in to the bottom of the spreader. You don't want to leave it hanging because it'll catch on this outer pan itself. As I'm doing that, I'm also going to be pulling the top half of the pintle chain rearward. But as I pull this top piece out, I want to kind of put lower pressure on it so that the gears, that are the drive gears, are actually going to pull the pintle chain off, and I'm not actually struggling to get it off. Let's let the engine and the motor do the work. I don't want to be doing the work. Okay, Andy, go ahead. Nice and slow. I'm feeding it in. Okay. You can turn it up a little bit. And I'm simply drawing the old chain off, letting the motor do the work. and our chain is off. So now's the time that we're going to install this brand new pintle chain. It's all nice and clean. So as you can see, I've attached my rope that we fed through the system itself because I'm going to be using this to pull the pintle chain back into the system. But before you do that, I want you to pay attention to the design of this pintle chain. You'll notice that the actual horizontal bars are actually bent slightly. Now what you want to do is you want to insert those so that that bend is putting the bar as close to the pan as possible. And remember, we're feeding this through from the bottom. So if you look at that profile of the bar itself, I'm going to be tipping this upside down, and it's going to be fed into the bottom. We're going to pull the rope and cycle it through that way. You want to make sure it's in the right orientation so that these bars are actually scraping the material off the pan when the pintle chain is engaged. Alright, so now is another time where it's nice to have an assistant. You could probably do it yourself, but it just takes a little bit longer. So as you're going to see, my assistant is actually be feeding the pintle chain into the bottom of the spreader as I pull on the rope, pulling it through. Now you're only going to be able to pull the pintle chain so far with the rope before the pintle engages the sprockets on the front. This is where we're actually going to have to go around to the front and help feed that through, making sure that all the sprockets are engaged in the chain. So here I am at the front of the spreader. As I was saying before, I've got to actually help feed this pintle chain through these sprockets. Now this front link is loose, so the most important thing I want to remember is I want to feed that into the track or into the pan as we're feeding through so it doesn't bind up. And then I'm just going to tell my assistant, pull the rope. Pull the rope, Andy. And he's simply going to pull it until it matches and gets to the rear install. Now that our chain's pulled through, all we simply need to do is reinstall those master links. And like I said before, lubrication is your friend, so you want to spray a little bit of this on there before you put that pin in place. Anti-seize, any of those types of things never hurt. Now that I got the master link reinstalled, I got my cotter keys in place, I simply have to go back to the front of the spreader with my 2 1/8 inch box end wrenches and retension that chain itself. Now when I took the tension off these tensioner bolts in the first place to get the chain off, remember all I simply did was crack that locking nut in order to move the bolt forward. So that kind of is my position where I want to return to. So I'm simply going to back the bolt out until the locking nut makes contact. And then I'm going to simply lock the locking nut on, and we're going to check the tension at the rear of the spreader. We're going to show you how we do that. Now how much tension you put on the chain is kind of dictated by the rear. What I'm going to be doing is I'm looking in on the bottom side of the hopper itself, and I'm looking at the drag chain as it kind of sags in the middle. Alright, I'm not looking at the gap here, I'm looking way in the middle of the spreader itself. And what I want to do is I want to put enough equal tension on both of the chain adjusters so that that chain on both sides is about 1/4 inch off the bottom. Once our chain is at its proper tension, we just got to simply slide the padding back in under the bottom. Since we got our pad and our chain back on, now's not a bad time to apply a little bit of actual grease or lubricant to the chain itself. Have somebody in the cab turn the spreader on slow and simply really well coat and grease that chain. Once that's done, we're simply going to reinstall the rear cover, put the spinner assembly back on, and we're done. So that's just as easy as it is to replace that pintle chain on your spreader. And remember, if you have any questions on any of the tips or steps that we walk through in this video, by all means, feel free to call our tech service line at the number at the bottom of the screen. Have a good day, and think Snow.